Thank you very much. Is my voice carrying?
Yeah.
Good. I'm very pleased, grateful really to be back at Central. It's beginning to feel like home. I very much enjoy coming and seeing my friends. Especially so at this particular time. We all know this is an extraordinary historical period that we're living through. So much is changing that any conclusions we reach at this point are necessarily very, very tentative, including conclusions about whether our president will succeed in his stated goal of resetting the course of America's relationship with the Arab and Islamic world. Confusion is confounded, of course, by the recent Libyan intervention. So a great deal is happening. In order to deal with it, I'm going to take a variety of approaches. I have been centered for many years in Cairo, although not exclusively. I was married in Tunisia, so I have links to other parts of the Arab world as well. But Cairo has been the base. And I think for historic, cultural, demographic reasons, Cairo and Egypt is very much the epicenter of the Arab uprising through which we are living. Having said that, it's also true that no Arab country is today unaffected by events. Began in Tunis, spread to Cairo, and then really throughout the Arab world: Morocco, Bahrain, Algeria, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Yemen, all affected by these events. There's one part of it that for me there's a great irony to it. For many, many years, really decades, there was a kind of contempt for the Arab street. It was regarded as somehow irrelevant. And now suddenly the Egyptians have really inspired us all. And I say especially the Egyptians because the numbers, the millions of people involved, and the coverage, even CNN of course was limping behind Al Jazeera, but still we had this extraordinary coverage. And those events made Tahrir Square, and I lived just outside of Tahrir Square, a kind of household word around the world. I mean, it's really extraordinary. So I'll be focused first on Egypt, and what I will do is look at some of the social texts that those thousands upon thousands of activists are carrying out. So I'll work from those first. Then for the Obama section of the talk, it can be a little bit more conventional. We have the historic Cairo Address, 2009, from the Cairo University, but also the more recent address, March 28th, on the intervention. So I will look at both of those texts for what they tell us about Obama's thinking. Does this represent, in fact, a new chapter in the course, in a new direction? And finally, I'll kind of wind up, and can be a little bit more informal there, wind up with kind of analytical reflections on what all of this means. So initially, impressions of events, especially focused on Cairo, then I'll look at the Obama text, and then finally some critical reflections on what these things mean. In brief, I will argue that Obama has made very little difference. If anything, the Obama years may well signal a further deterioration of the standing of America in the Middle East. That's the thesis. So let me first turn to Tahrir Square. The Egyptian uprising has three very distinctive faces. And the extraordinary young people of Egypt gave the uprising a first and really beautiful, unforgettable face. They are the Facebook generation. They're young, they're educated, they're principled, and they're fearless. Their laptops, their courage, their awareness, their bodies, those were the weapons that they had. They announced no religious program. They belonged to no single political party. they made their uprising with the cross in one hand and the crescent in another. Their demands were the most elemental for freedom, for human rights. What was extraordinary about the young people is they simply made it very clear that they were willing to die for those principles. And with that courage, they shattered this 30-year climate, atmosphere, prison of fear within which Egyptians were locked. And that was really, I think, their most astonishing, most surprising, most important contribution. And they did that in Tahrir Square. And they stayed in Tahrir Square. One of the extraordinary moments was when the thugs, mobilized by some of the wealthy supporters of Mubarak and Mubarak himself, attacked the demonstrators. You remember the scenes, the horses, the camels, the flood. I was on the cell phone with 5 different people. One of them was in the mosque. The mosque right outside of the square was acting as a hospital. He's saying to me, Raymond, there is blood everywhere. I mean, we have to remind ourselves, this is a beautiful place, but there were young people who were killed, and blood everywhere. So we're talking, his name's Ramadan. I said, well, Ramadan, what are you going to do? What are you going to do tomorrow? He said, look, I'm going back. This is our moment. It's the only moment we are going to have. And that, to me, was the turning point. After that attempt at intimidation that included killing people, included a lot of bloodshed, Egyptians went back the next day. And they went back in thousands. Just absolutely true. And as you know, they continued going back. Every Friday, Friday's the day of prayer, perfect day for demonstrations, people are already out, mobilized in Tahrir Square. And it was really those displays of people power and the kind of intelligence of keeping it up and keeping it going that allowed the achievements, I think, of that uprising. So that's the first phase. It's Egypt's uprising. It's a youth revolution. The problem, though, with a beautiful face is that it can overwhelm everything else. And there's another face to Egypt's revolution, and that is the social dimension, which has gotten much less attention. For those of us who live in Cairo, live in Egypt, we know that for years now there's been a building momentum of demonstrations by workers. Mahalla, for example, inspired one of the most important of the youth groups organized in support of the workers at Mahalla. So a series of labor strikes. There were also other kinds of actions, political actions. See, one of the things that happened in the Arab uprising was that people by that time had political skills. They knew how to do street fighting. They knew how to engage the security police. They had a lot of practice, including ordinary people. You saw really quite amazing things would happen. A village would have no electricity, no water, total neglect. So what would they do? The peasants would simply pour out of the village and block the highway that ran right next to it. Just as a spontaneous, you had that happening in some of the poor sections and poor districts of the city. So these were kind of spontaneous eruptions. They didn't register, certainly in the international media, but they are part of it. And I say that because the young people, the Facebook generation, they issued the call for revolution. They set the date, come on such and such a date. But what was important is that people responded. I mean, how many times have we issued invitations and nobody comes? This time they came. And I think they came for those social reasons. But, this was the thing, we all saw it. You could see, these were families. People came and they brought their children, and then they stayed overnight and they slept. And families organized their lives around participation. One friend, a guy was out of the city a little bit, in one of the suburbs. So he had to be there, so he left his teenage son to sort of protect the building. The sort of self-organization of Egyptians was really extraordinary. They protected the museum, for example. These were ordinary citizens. They protected their neighborhoods. They protected the schools. And they kind of organized this. So this guy, the teenage son, he was in charge of the building, to protect the building, where the father went to the square, and he sat there, day after day after day after day. And suddenly, food appeared, and water appeared, and whatever. It was really great. But that was the social revolution. And that was ordinary people. So they came to the square with their children, with their friends, with their family, without their laptops. So I think it's a, because they don't have laptops. So, you know, we want to focus on the Facebook generation, yes, but the second revolution is also important. And that's the other phase. This is the phase, it's a social revolution. And ordinary people are critical for its success. Finally, I think there's a third phase of the revolution. I'll call it the political revolution. This is the political phase. Because the importance is that this was an uprising directed against the national security of the state. And that's why it resonated so widely throughout the region. All of these states are these repressive national security states. They have nothing to do with Islamic tradition. They're essentially post-colonial creations imposed on the area. They serve external interests rather than internal interests. And Mubarak was simply an emblem of that kind of state. So the that's the political dimension, the dismantling, the assault on that state, the dismantling. And that, I think, is the third phase, the political phase of the revolution. The political dimension, I thought, was conveyed in a very graphic way. And again, we all share the images. You remember the Friday after Mubarak had stepped down, and the young people decided that they wanted a major figure to sort of address the assembled thousands. And they turned not to the American-groomed secular types that were kind of, you know, waiting in the wings and kind of assumed that they were going to move in and take over. They turned instead to someone called Yusuf al-Qaradawi. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, some of you know him. He's probably the most prominent of Sunni sheikhs in the world. Qaradawi, I actually saw him, I didn't realize that at the time, in the early 80s. He gave a lecture at one of the professional associations. And just by chance I went, and it turned out that was the last lecture for decades. He was banned from returning. He was allowed to come, but he couldn't speak to Egyptians. So there was this incredible symbolism. He's in his 80s. A mere slip of a boy, 82. So the older I get, the younger that sounds. He's in his 80s. And he's surrounded by the Facebook generation. And he was, so even just the, just the image was extraordinarily powerful. What was even more powerful than the image in the things that Qaradawi said. And there were certain gestures that he made, which were, again, symbolically absolute. This is the Friday prayer. Who does he address the Friday prayer to? Muslims and Christians. Very pointed. And, that was this incredible statement. But only Qaradawi could get away with that. Second thing, what he said to the young people was among the most touching moments that I experienced as part of that. Is he looked at them and he said, I want to kiss the hand of every young person who contributed to making this revolution. Now in the Middle East, if you've got the white hair, you're the one who gets the hand kiss. Yeah? It's not the other way around. So it was just a very, it's culturally specific, but a very powerful gesture. His analysis is also interesting to pay attention to. Qaradawi delivered a very clear message. He was part of the strategy that the revolutionary uprising could not afford to alienate the military. Look, they're basically unarmed. If the military had turned against them, that's the end. So he was sort of very astute in, praising, our sons in uniform and so forth and so on. But then he said very clearly, a warning to the young people. He said, you're making your revolution is not made, and you must guard the revolution. You must guard the revolution. And he clearly had in mind the threat from the military. And that's, of course, the history of the area, that you have these military regimes. So there was, I think, an important message as well, aside from the sheer symbolism of the connection. And of course, the way it was interpreted, we can talk about that in the questions about it. this is a Muslim Brotherhood figure, represents the Islamic faith. This is some of the articles. This is Khomeini returning. Of course, they paid no attention to what the man said. Absolutely.